After 37 years of faithful service, they fired me through a text message. The words hung in the air like a death sentence, carrying the weight of a lifetime's devotion crushed in a single moment. Welcome back, and tell me what city you're watching from or what time it is. Enjoy this story that might just change how you see the world. Margaret Sullivan's weathered hands trembled as she clutched her Nokia flip phone, the blue glow of the screen reflecting off her wire-rimmed glasses. The fluorescent lights of the hospital break room buzzed overhead like angry wasps, casting harsh shadows across her face. A face that had seen 63 years of life, with lines etched deep by decades of night shifts, double shifts, and holidays spent caring for others while her own family celebrated without her. Her navy blue janitor's uniform hung loose on her thin frame, the fabric worn soft from countless industrial washes. The name tag pinned to her chest read, Margaret S. Environmental Services, but to most people walking these sterile corridors she was invisible, just another piece of equipment that kept the hospital running, as essential as the oxygen tanks and heart monitors, yet noticed only when something went wrong. The text message glowed on her phone screen. Due to budget cuts, your position has been eliminated effective immediately. Please return all hospital property to security. Thank you for your service. HR Department. 37 years. Margaret had started working at Chicago General Hospital when she was 26, a young widow with 2 small children and nothing but determination keeping her afloat after her husband's sudden heart attack left her drowning in medical bills and grief. She had walked through these same doors every night at 11 p.m. for over 3 decades, carrying her mop bucket and supplies with the quiet dignity of someone who understood that her work mattered, even if nobody else seemed to notice. She had cleaned blood from operating room floors after emergency surgeries that saved lives. She had scrubbed away tears from the family waiting areas where people received the worst news of their lives. She had mopped up the first steps of newborn babies and the final breaths of elderly patients. Every surface she touched, every floor she cleaned, every bathroom she maintained was part of a sacred trust, keeping the hospital safe and sanitary for the thousands of people who passed through seeking healing. Margaret's reflection stared back at her from the break room's grimy mirror. Her grey hair was pulled back in the same neat bun she'd worn for decades, secured with bobby pins that had probably cost her more than some people spent on lunch. Her face bore the exhaustion of someone who had worked nights for so long that sunlight felt foreign against her skin. Dark circles under her eyes told the story of sleep stolen by necessity, of a body that had adapted to living in the spaces between other people's daylight hours. The phone buzzed again. Another text, this time from her supervisor. Margaret, heard about the layoffs. Really sorry. You were one of the good ones. Best of luck. One of the good ones. As if being reliable, punctual, and hardworking for nearly 4 decades was some kind of lucky accident rather than a deliberate choice she made every single day. As if showing up when she was sick, working through holidays, and covering shifts for younger employees who called in hungover was just natural talent, rather than the kind of character that seemed increasingly rare in the world. Margaret thought about Mrs. Chen in room 314, who had been in the hospital for 2 weeks with complications from diabetes. Every night, Margaret would save the woman's favorite magazines from the recycling bin and leave them folded neatly on her bedside table. Mrs. Chen always smiled and whispered thank you in broken English, understanding that kindness often came in small gestures that nobody else noticed or remembered. She thought about young Tommy Rodriguez in pediatrics, the 8-year-old with leukemia, who was afraid of the dark. Margaret had learned to time her cleaning schedule so she could peek into his room during her rounds, just to make sure his nightlight was working and he wasn't crying alone. Sometimes she would quietly adjust his blankets or move his water cup closer to his bed, tiny acts of care that fell far outside her job description but felt essential to her sense of purpose. Margaret remembered the night 3 years ago when Dr. Harrison's teenage daughter had been brought in after a car accident. The surgeon, a man who barely acknowledged Margaret's existence during normal circumstances, had broken down sobbing in the hallway, his expensive scrubs soaked with tears and blood. Margaret had quietly brought him a cup of coffee and a clean towel, standing beside him in silence while he grieved. He had looked at her then, really looked at her, and whispered thank you, with the kind of gratitude that comes from having someone witness your humanity in a moment of complete vulnerability. But none of that mattered now. Budget cuts, they said. Downsizing. Corporate efficiency measures designed by people in boardrooms who had never held a mop or emptied a bedpan. who saw employees as line items on spreadsheets rather than human beings with families and bills and dreams that extended beyond their work shifts. Margaret's hands shook as she opened her metal locker for the last time. Inside hung her spare uniform, a package of saltine crackers she kept for nights when her blood sugar dropped, and a small framed photo of her grandchildren, Emma and Tyler, ages 6 and 4, who called her Grandma Maggie and believed she was the strongest person in the world because she worked at the hospital where doctors saved lives. How would she explain this to them? How do you tell children who think you're invincible that the world had decided you were disposable? That 37 years of dedication and service could be erased with a text message sent while you were mopping the floors of the very institution that had just discarded you. The break room door opened, and Janet Williams walked in, another night shift worker, but from the nursing staff. Janet earned 3 times Margaret's salary and had the kind of health insurance benefits that Margaret could only dream about. She looked at Margaret with what might have been sympathy or might have been relief that she wasn't the one receiving bad news. "I heard about the layoffs," Janet said, her voice carrying the awkward tone of someone who wasn't sure how to navigate this conversation. "That's really rough. Have you thought about applying for unemployment benefits?" Margaret almost laughed. Unemployment benefits that might cover a third of her already modest income, available only after weeks of bureaucratic paperwork and waiting periods designed to discourage people from applying. Benefits that would run out long before she could find another job at her age, in a market that preferred younger workers who would accept lower wages and fewer benefits. "I'll figure something out," Margaret replied, her voice steady despite the chaos in her heart. She had been figuring things out for 6 decades, how to feed her children on food stamps and waitressing tips, how to pay rent when her husband died and left her with nothing but debt, how to work nights while raising teenagers who needed guidance and supervision. She would figure this out too somehow, because the alternative was unthinkable. Margaret gathered her few personal belongings and walked toward the security desk, her footsteps echoing in the empty corridors she had traversed thousands of times. The hospital felt different now, not like a place where she belonged, but like a stranger's house where she was no longer welcome. The familiar smells of disinfectant and floor wax that had once comforted her now seemed to mock her displacement. At the security desk, she handed over her badge, keys, and the small radio she used to communicate with other night shift workers. The guard, a young man named Marcus, who had always greeted her warmly, avoided eye contact as he processed her termination paperwork. "Take care of yourself, Mrs. Sullivan," he mumbled, his embarrassment palpable. Margaret nodded and turned toward the exit, walking past the information desk, where she had started every shift for 37 years, past the elevators that had carried her to every floor of the building, past the photographs of hospital board members, whose names she knew but who had never bothered to learn hers. The automatic doors slid open with a soft hiss, and Margaret stepped into the Chicago night air, the cool breeze hitting her face like a slap of reality. Behind her, the hospital continued its relentless rhythm of healing and heartbreak, its lights blazing against the darkness, carrying on without the woman who had helped keep it running for more than a third of a century. For the first time in 37 years, Margaret Sullivan had nowhere to go at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday night, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she began to cry. Margaret's apartment in the south side of Chicago felt smaller than usual that night, the silence pressing against her ears like cotton. She sat at her kitchen table, a scarred wooden surface she'd bought second-hand 20 years ago, staring at the bills scattered before her like accusations. Rent, $8.90. Electric, $127. Groceries, whatever was left after everything else. And now, no paycheck coming next week. The apartment bore the hallmarks of someone who had learned to make do with very little. Furniture collected from yard sales and charity shops, arranged with the careful attention of someone who understood that dignity didn't require expensive things, just clean, well-maintained ones. The walls were painted a cheerful yellow that Margaret had applied herself during a weekend off 3 years ago, and family photographs in mismatched frames created a gallery of love that money couldn't buy. But tonight, even the familiar comfort of her home couldn't chase away the memories flooding back. Memories of all the times she'd been treated as less than human by the very people she'd served so faithfully. She remembered her first week at the hospital when Dr. Pemberton had barked at her for mopping near the nurses' station during his rounds. "Can't you people clean somewhere else?" he'd snapped. gesturing dismissively as if she were a piece of malfunctioning equipment rather than a person trying to do her job. She had apologized and moved away, learning the first of many lessons about when and where her presence was unwelcome. Over the years, she had become expert at reading the subtle signals of hospital hierarchy. She knew to avert her eyes when administrators passed in the hallways, understanding that direct eye contact from someone in her position was considered presumptuous. She had learned to clean around important conversations, moving like a ghost through spaces where her presence was necessary, but her humanity was invisible. Margaret thought about all the Christmas parties she had cleaned up after but never been invited to attend. She would arrive for her night shift to find the remnants of celebration: empty champagne glasses, crumpled napkins, half-eaten catered food that cost more than she spent on groceries in a month. The hospital staff would have gone home to their families, leaving behind the evidence of their joy for her to erase, as if the party had never happened. She remembered overhearing conversations that stung like paper cuts, small wounds that accumulated over time into something deeper and more painful. "At least Margaret keeps the floors clean," a nurse had said once, her tone suggesting this was Margaret's only redeeming quality. "She's not the brightest, but she's reliable." Margaret had been standing just around the corner, invisible as always, absorbing the casual cruelty of being reduced to a single function. There had been the incident 5 years ago when her grandson Tyler had been born premature and spent weeks in the NICU. Margaret had requested time off to help her daughter during the crisis, only to be told that personal problems shouldn't interfere with work responsibilities. She had worked her regular shifts while her family faced their darkest hours, sneaking peeks at Tyler through the NICU windows during her brief breaks, her heart breaking with each visit to see her tiny grandson fighting for life while she pushed a mop through corridors that felt increasingly like a prison. Doctor Harrison's words from that awful night came back to her now. "You people need to understand that this is a professional environment." The phrase, "you people," had hit her like a slap. She had been cleaning blood from the emergency room floor after a particularly difficult surgery, trying to restore order and sanitation to a space where someone had just fought for their life. But to Dr. Harrison, she was just "you people," part of an anonymous underclass whose labor kept his world functioning while remaining beneath his notice or consideration. Margaret remembered the time she had found Mrs. Patterson, an elderly patient, crying alone in the bathroom at 2 a.m. The woman had fallen trying to reach the call button and was too embarrassed to ask for help. Margaret had gently helped her back to bed, stayed with her until she fell asleep, and never mentioned the incident to anyone, understanding instinctively that Mrs. Patterson's dignity mattered more than protocol. The next day, Mrs. Patterson's daughter had tried to give Margaret a small tip for her kindness, but hospital policy forbade accepting gifts. The daughter had looked confused. "But she went above and beyond," the nurse had shrugged. "That's just Margaret doing her job. Just Margaret doing her job." As if compassion and human decency were simply part of her employment contract, rather than choices she made every single day to treat people with the respect and care she rarely received herself. She thought about all the times she had covered shifts for younger employees who called in sick with hangovers or wanted long weekends. Margaret had never called in sick herself, not when she had pneumonia 2 winters ago, not when her back spasmed from years of mopping floors, not even when her daughter had been in a car accident and needed someone to drive her to physical therapy appointments. Margaret had always found a way to be at work because she understood that other people depended on her, even if they didn't appreciate or acknowledge that dependence. The irony was bitter. She had been one of the most reliable employees in the hospital's history, yet she was also one of the most expendable. Her dedication had been taken for granted for so long that it had become invisible, like the cleanliness she maintained that only became noticeable when it was absent. Margaret remembered the employee appreciation lunch 3 years ago, a catered affair in the hospital conference room where administrators had given speeches about the hospital family and the importance of every team member. She had been invited, officially, but when she arrived in her best dress, a navy blue outfit she'd bought at Goodwill, and hemmed herself, she realized she was the only non-medical staff member present. The conversation swirled around her like a foreign language: medical conferences, vacation homes, children's private schools, stock portfolios. She had eaten her sandwich in silence, understanding that her invitation had been a gesture of political correctness rather than genuine inclusion. Dr. Matthews had even patted her shoulder that day, saying loud enough for others to hear, "Margaret keeps us all humble, don't you, Margaret?" The comment had been meant as kindness, but it felt like condescension, as if her purpose was to serve as a reminder of how fortunate the real hospital staff were to have professional careers and middle-class security. She thought about her own children, now adults with families of their own, and how she had worked nights partly so she could be available during their school days. She had attended every parent-teacher conference, every school play, every graduation ceremony on very little sleep, because she understood that being present mattered more than being rested. Her children had grown up proud of their mother's work ethic, but Margaret sometimes wondered if they truly understood the daily indignities she endured to provide for them. Her daughter Sarah had once suggested that Margaret look for something better than hospital cleaning. "Mom, you're so smart and capable. Surely there's something more." She had meant well, but the comment revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of the employment market for women of Margaret's age and educational background. There wasn't something better waiting for her. There was only the work she was grateful to have, performed with a dignity that had to come from within, because it certainly wasn't provided by the environment. Margaret stood up from her kitchen table and walked to the window overlooking the street. The neighborhood was quiet at this hour, streetlights creating pools of yellow illumination between stretches of darkness. A few windows glowed in neighboring buildings, other people's lives continuing their normal rhythms while hers lay in pieces. She pressed her palm against the cool glass and thought about tomorrow. She would need to apply for unemployment benefits, update a resume that hadn't been relevant for decades, and begin the humiliating process of job searching at 63 years old. She would have to explain to potential employers why someone her age was looking for work, navigate interview questions designed for people half her age, and compete against candidates who didn't carry the perceived liability of approaching retirement. But perhaps most difficult of all, she would have to maintain hope in a world that had just demonstrated once again that her value as a human being was measured solely by her economic productivity, and that 37 years of faithful service could be erased with the cold efficiency of a text message. Margaret closed her eyes and tried to remember the last time someone had looked at her, really looked at her, and seen something more than a uniform and a mop bucket. The memory took a long time to surface, and when it did, it brought tears to her eyes all over again. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight she allowed herself to grieve for the life that had been taken from her without ceremony or consideration, and for the dreams she had never quite dared to dream because they had seemed too far beyond the reach of someone like her. Someone who was, apparently, just Margaret doing her job. 3 days after her termination, Margaret found herself sitting in the waiting room of Chicago General's Human Resources Department, clutching a manila envelope containing forms she barely understood. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, the same lights she had cleaned beneath for 37 years, but now they felt harsh and accusatory, illuminating her from the perspective of a supplicant rather than an employee. The HR representative, a woman in her 30s named Ashley Morrison, had called Margaret about her transition package. Ashley wore a tailored blazer that probably cost more than Margaret's monthly grocery budget, and her manicured nails clicked against her tablet as she scrolled through what Margaret assumed was her employment file. "Mrs. Sullivan," Ashley began, not bothering to look up from her screen, "I need to inform you that there's been an issue with your final paperwork." Margaret's stomach clenched. She had hoped this meeting would be routine, sign some forms, collect her final paycheck, perhaps receive information about continuing her health insurance through Cobra. Instead, Ashley's tone carried the weight of bad news delivered with bureaucratic efficiency. "It appears that during your employment, there were several instances of irregularities in your work performance that were never formally documented." Ashley finally looked up, her expression carefully neutral in the way that suggested she'd been trained to deliver unpleasant information without appearing heartless. Margaret stared at her, confusion mixing with growing dread. "Irregularities? I don't understand. I never received any disciplinary actions. My supervisors always said my work was satisfactory." Ashley's fingers danced across her tablet screen. "Yes, well, verbal feedback doesn't always align with official documentation. We've received reports that you sometimes exceeded your assigned duties, which created liability concerns for the hospital." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. Exceeded her assigned duties. They were talking about the countless times she had helped patients, comforted frightened children, stayed late to ensure areas were properly sanitized. The very actions that had made her feel human in a job that often treated her as invisible were now being weaponized against her. "I helped people," Margaret said quietly, her voice barely audible in the sterile office. "If someone needed assistance, I helped them." "That's exactly the problem," Ashley replied, her tone taking on the patience of someone explaining obvious concepts to a slow child. "Hospital liability insurance doesn't cover non-medical staff providing patient care. Every time you interacted with patients beyond your custodial duties, you exposed the hospital to potential lawsuits." Margaret thought about Mrs. Chen, about little Tommy Rodriguez, about the countless patients she had treated with basic human kindness. Now she was learning that her compassion had been viewed as a liability, that her instinct to help people in need had been seen as a problem to be managed rather than a quality to be valued. Ashley continued reading from her tablet. "Additionally, there are reports that you accessed areas of the hospital during off-duty hours. Security logs show your badge being used in pediatrics and the ICU when you weren't scheduled to be working." "I was visiting my grandson," Margaret whispered, the memory of Tyler's premature birth flooding back with painful clarity. "He was in the NICU for 3 weeks. I used my badge to see him during visiting hours. Hospital policy clearly states that employee access badges are not to be used for personal visits. Using your badge to access restricted areas for non-work purposes is considered a security violation." Margaret felt the room spinning slightly. They were taking her darkest, most vulnerable moments, watching her premature grandson fight for life, and transforming them into evidence of misconduct. The nights she had stood outside the NICU windows, praying for Tyler's recovery while fighting exhaustion from her work shifts, were being reframed as security breaches. "Furthermore," Ashley continued with relentless precision, "there are documented instances of you removing items from hospital property without authorization." Margaret's heart stopped. "I never stole anything. Not ever. Magazines from the waiting areas, food items from patient meal trays that were being discarded, blankets that were scheduled for disposal." Ashley's voice carried no emotion, as if she were reading a grocery list rather than destroying someone's reputation. Margaret remembered saving magazines for Mrs. Chen, rescuing perfectly good food from waste bins to give to homeless people she encountered on her way to work, taking worn blankets that were being thrown away to homeless shelters during Chicago's brutal winters. Acts of simple human decency were being recast as theft. "These items were being thrown away," Margaret said, her voice growing stronger with indignation. "I gave them to people who needed them. Regardless of your intentions, removing hospital property without proper authorization constitutes theft under Illinois state law." Ashley's expression remained unchanged, as if Margaret's explanations were irrelevant to the bureaucratic machinery grinding her reputation to dust. The final blow came when Ashley slid a document across the desk. "Due to these violations, the hospital is unable to provide a positive reference for future employment. Additionally, your final paycheck will be reduced by the estimated value of items removed from hospital property over the past year." Margaret stared at the paper, the words blurring through tears she refused to let fall. Her final paycheck, money she desperately needed to keep her apartment and buy groceries, was being garnished for the crime of showing kindness to people society had forgotten. The blankets she had given to freezing homeless veterans would cost her the ability to heat her own home. "I don't understand," Margaret said, her voice breaking despite her efforts to maintain composure. 37 years. I never missed a day. I worked holidays. I stayed late when other people called in sick. How can you just erase all of that?" Ashley's expression softened slightly, perhaps recognizing that she was witnessing the destruction of someone's entire sense of self-worth. "Mrs. Sullivan, I want you to understand that this isn't personal. These are just policy issues that came to light during the review of your termination. The hospital appreciates your years of service, but we have to follow protocol, not personal." As if reducing someone's life work to a series of policy violations was somehow more humane when delivered without malice. As if the systematic destruction of her reputation and financial security was acceptable, as long as the person wielding the sledgehammer felt no personal animosity. Margaret signed the papers because she had no choice. Her trembling hands guided the pen across documents that transformed 37 years of faithful service into a cautionary tale about employees who didn't know their place. When she finished, Ashley handed her a business card for a temp agency that specialized in placing mature workers in part-time positions. They might be able to help you find something suitable, Ashley said. The word suitable, carrying the clear implication that Margaret should lower her expectations significantly. Margaret walked through the hospital corridors one final time, past the nurses' station, where she had been yelled at for cleaning during rounds, past the conference room where she had felt so out of place during the employee appreciation lunch, past the NICU where her grandson had fought for life while she was accused of security violations for loving him. The automatic doors slid open, and she stepped into the Chicago afternoon, carrying with her not just the pain of unemployment, but the devastating knowledge that her attempts to maintain dignity and humanity in a dehumanizing environment had been carefully documented and filed as evidence of her unworthiness. In the parking lot, she sat in her 15-year-old Honda Civic and finally allowed herself to cry, not just for the job she had lost, but for the person she had apparently never been allowed to be. The hospital had taken everything: her livelihood, her reputation, her sense of purpose, and finally her belief that kindness was valued in the world. But as she sat there in the gathering dusk, clutching the business card for the temp agency, something deep inside Margaret began to shift. The tears of devastation were slowly transforming into something else, a quiet rage at the injustice of it all, and perhaps, for the first time in her life, a dangerous question about whether she had spent 37 years accepting treatment that no human being should ever have to endure. The woman who drove home that evening was not quite the same woman who had walked into the HR office that morning. Something had broken inside her, but it wasn't her spirit. It was her willingness to remain invisible. Word traveled fast through the hospital corridors. By the next morning, everyone knew about Margaret's termination and the accusations that had followed her out the door. The reactions revealed more about the hospital's culture than Margaret could have imagined during her years of faithful service. Dr. Harrison cornered Janet Williams near the medication cart during the day shift. "I heard about Margaret," he said with the satisfied tone of someone whose worldview had been confirmed. "Honestly, I'm not surprised. You give these people an inch and they take a mile. Always knew she was getting too comfortable, thinking she could just wander around the hospital like she owned the place." Janet shifted uncomfortably, remembering all the times Margaret had stayed late to help with difficult patients, had quietly cleaned up messes that weren't technically her responsibility. "She seemed like she was just trying to be helpful," Janet offered weakly. "Helpful?" Dr. Harrison scoffed. "She was overstepping boundaries. Patient interaction is for trained medical professionals, not—" He gestured dismissively, not bothering to finish the sentence. The implication hung in the air like a toxic cloud. People like Margaret should know their place. Dr. Matthews, the physician who had once patted Margaret's shoulder at the employee appreciation lunch, shook his head when he heard the news. "Such a shame," he told his colleagues during their morning coffee break. "Margaret always seemed so grateful for her position. I guess you never really know people. Goes to show that some people just can't handle responsibility." The conversation continued around the expensive coffee machine in the doctor's lounge, a space Margaret had cleaned countless times, but never been invited to enter as anything other than custodial staff. "We probably should have seen the signs," Dr. Pemberton added, taking liberties with hospital property, making herself at home in restricted areas. Classic entitlement behavior. None of them mentioned the nights Margaret had worked double shifts when they were understaffed. None of them remembered how she had quietly handled their messes without complaint, how she had maintained their work environment with the kind of attention to detail that came from genuine pride in her work. Their memories had been conveniently edited to support the narrative that Margaret's termination was justified, even inevitable. But not everyone bought into the official story. Maria Santos, a young nursing assistant who worked the night shift, had witnessed Margaret's kindness firsthand. She remembered the night her own grandmother had been admitted to the ICU, how Margaret had appeared with a cup of coffee and a gentle word during the long hours of waiting. Margaret had asked about Maria's family, had listened to her fears about losing someone who had raised her, had offered the kind of human connection that hospital protocols couldn't provide. "This is bullshit," Maria muttered to her friend Carmen during their lunch break. Margaret never stole anything. She gave away stuff that was literally going in the dumpster. "And helping patients? That's called being a decent human being." Carmen nodded, but her expression was cautious. "Keep your voice down, Maria. You don't want administration thinking you're defending someone they've decided is a problem." The warning was well-founded. In the days following Margaret's termination, a subtle but unmistakable message had been sent throughout the hospital. Questioning the official narrative was a career-limiting move. Other custodial staff began working with mechanical precision, avoiding any action that might be construed as exceeding their duties. The warmth and humanity that Margaret had brought to her work was being systematically eliminated from the hospital culture. Marcus, the security guard who had processed Margaret's termination paperwork, felt sick every time he remembered the shame in her eyes. He had been working at the hospital for only 2 years, but he had noticed how Margaret's presence seemed to make the place feel more human. She was the only staff member who consistently greeted him by name, who asked about his classes at community college, who had celebrated with him when he passed his EMT certification exam. Marcus knew about the security footage that had been used against Margaret. He had seen her visiting the NICU during her grandson's hospitalization, had watched her moving through the corridors with the quiet dignity of someone whose only crime was loving her family. The idea that these visits were being classified as security violations made him question everything about the institution he worked for. One evening, unable to sleep with the weight of his guilt, Marcus made a decision that would change everything. Margaret was sitting in her kitchen, struggling with unemployment paperwork that seemed designed to confuse rather than assist, when her phone rang. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, and for a moment she considered not answering. Bad news had been arriving by phone too frequently lately. "Mrs. Sullivan, this is Marcus Johnson from Hospital Security. I hope it's okay that I'm calling you." Margaret's heart raced. Had they discovered some new violation to add to her file? "Hello, Marcus. What can I do for you?" "Ma'am, I need to tell you something, and I hope you won't hang up on me." Marcus's voice carried a tremor of nervousness, as if he was about to cross a line from which there was no return. "What they did to you, it isn't right, and I have information that might help you." Margaret felt something stir in her chest. Not hope exactly, but a flicker of possibility that maybe, just maybe, someone had witnessed the injustice and was willing to speak up. Marcus continued, his words coming faster, as if he needed to get them out, before losing his courage. "I've been working security here for 2 years, and I've seen the footage they used against you. Mrs. Sullivan, there's nothing in those recordings that shows wrongdoing. You visiting your grandson in the NICU. You had every right to be there during visiting hours. You helping patients who needed assistance. I've got footage of doctors and nurses doing the exact same things and being praised for their compassion." Margaret's hands began to shake. "Marcus, you could get in trouble for telling me this." "Yes, ma'am, I probably could. But my grandmother raised me to speak up when I see injustice, and this is about as unjust as anything I've ever witnessed." Marcus paused, then continued with quiet determination. "Mrs. Sullivan, there's something else. I've been documenting incidents of staff behavior that makes what you were accused of look like nothing. Dr. Harrison taking home medical supplies for his personal use. Nurses using hospital computers for personal business during work hours. Administrator Ashley Morrison using her position to get free medical care for her family members." Margaret closed her eyes, feeling a mixture of vindication and fury. The same people who had destroyed her reputation were guilty of far worse violations, but their status protected them from the accountability that had been ruthlessly applied to her. "Why are you telling me this?" Margaret asked. "Because someone needs to know the truth," Marcus replied. "And because I think you deserve better than what they gave you. My grandmother worked as a housekeeper for 40 years, and she always said that the people who clean up after others are the ones who really know what's going on. She said those people deserve respect, not just because of their work, but because of what they see and never say." That night, Margaret sat in her living room holding a manila envelope that Marcus had left in her mailbox. Inside were copies of security reports, documentation of policy violations by hospital staff, and a written statement from Marcus detailing the discriminatory treatment he had witnessed during Margaret's termination process. For the first time since her firing, Margaret felt something other than despair. She felt the stirring of righteous anger, the slow burn of someone who had been pushed too far and was finally ready to push back. But even as she reviewed the evidence that could potentially clear her name, Margaret understood that fighting back would require her to step out of the shadows where she had lived for 37 years. It would mean demanding that people see her not as invisible custodial staff, but as a human being deserving of dignity and respect. The question that kept her awake that night was whether she had the courage to stop being invisible, even if it meant facing more rejection and humiliation. The question that would determine not just her future, but her sense of who she really was beneath the uniform, and the deference that had defined her for so long. As dawn broke over Chicago, Margaret made a decision that would have seemed impossible just a week earlier. She picked up her phone and dialed the number for the State Labor Department's discrimination hotline. It was time to stop accepting the unacceptable. It was time for Margaret Sullivan to be seen. 2 weeks after her termination, Margaret found herself walking through the revolving doors of Chicago General Hospital once more. But this time, she wasn't carrying a mop bucket or wearing a faded uniform. She wore her best navy dress, the same one from the employee appreciation lunch, and carried a leather briefcase she had borrowed from her daughter. Inside were Marcus's documents, copies of her employment records, and a letter from the Illinois Department of Labor requesting a formal meeting to discuss allegations of discriminatory termination. The hospital's legal department had tried to schedule the meeting in a small conference room tucked away in the basement. But Margaret's newly appointed advocate, a sharp-eyed attorney named Rebecca Chen from the Workers' Rights Coalition, had insisted on the main boardroom. "If they want to air your business publicly," Rebecca had said, "then let's make sure the whole hospital can see how they treat their most loyal employees." Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she entered the boardroom where hospital board meetings were held, where million-dollar decisions were made by people who had never mopped a floor or emptied a bedpan. The polished mahogany table reflected the morning light streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows, and Margaret couldn't help but think about how many hours she had spent cleaning windows just like these, making sure other people's meetings could proceed in spotless environments. Dr. Robert Steinberg, Chief Medical Officer, sat at the head of the table with the confident posture of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in the room. Beside him sat Ashley Morrison from HR, her tablet at the ready, and the hospital's head attorney, James Walsh, whose expensive suit probably cost more than Margaret's monthly rent. "Mrs. Sullivan," Dr. Steinberg began, his tone carrying the patronizing warmth of someone addressing a confused child, "I hope we can resolve this misunderstanding quickly and amicably. The hospital has always valued your contributions, and we're certainly sorry if you feel your termination was handled inappropriately." Rebecca Chen leaned forward, her voice crisp and professional. "Dr. Steinberg, my client isn't here because she feels wronged. She's here because she was demonstrably discriminated against, and because your hospital has systematically violated Illinois labor law in her treatment." Ashley Morrison's fingers danced across her tablet. "As I've documented, Mrs. Sullivan violated multiple hospital policies during her employment. We have security footage and incident reports that clearly show a dedicated employee helping patients and visiting her hospitalized grandson," Rebecca interrupted, sliding a thick folder across the table. "What you don't have is any documentation of these alleged violations being addressed during her 37 years of employment. Not a single written warning, not one disciplinary action, not even a verbal counseling session. Isn't it convenient that these violations only became problematic when budget cuts required eliminating her position?" Margaret watched the attorneys and administrators exchange glances, and for the first time in weeks, she felt something approaching satisfaction. These people who had treated her as invisible were now forced to sit at the same table to defend their actions to her face. Dr. Steinberg cleared his throat. "Mrs. Sullivan, surely you understand that hospitals operate under strict liability guidelines. When staff exceed their assigned duties, regardless of good intentions, it creates risks that we simply cannot stop." Margaret's voice cut through the corporate speak with startling clarity. The room fell silent, every face turning toward her with expressions ranging from surprise to irritation. Margaret had interrupted the chief medical officer, something the old Margaret would never have dared to do. "Dr. Steinberg," Margaret continued, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins, "for 37 years, I listened to you and people like you talk about liability and policies and appropriate boundaries. I cleaned your messes, literally and figuratively, while you lectured me about exceeding my duties." She stood up, her hands no longer trembling. "Do you remember Mrs. Patterson in room 412, 87 years old, fell trying to reach her call button at 2 in the morning? I helped her back to bed and stayed with her until she felt safe. You're telling me that was exceeding my duties?" Dr. Steinberg's jaw tightened. "Mrs. Sullivan, patient care requires proper training and certification. And do you remember little Tommy Rodriguez in pediatrics?" Margaret's voice grew stronger, 37 years of suppressed frustration finally finding its voice. 8 years old. terrified of the dark because of his chemotherapy treatments. I made sure his nightlight was working and adjusted his blankets so he could sleep. That was exceeding my duties too. Ashley Morrison looked up from her tablet. Mrs. Sullivan, please understand that we're not questioning your intentions. Yes, you are. Margaret turned to face Ashley directly. You're questioning everything I am. Every act of human decency I showed in this hospital, you've twisted into a violation. Every moment of compassion I offered to scared, sick people, you've reframed as liability. The room was dead quiet now. Margaret could see security guards stationed outside the glass doors, ready to escort her out if she became disruptive. But she wasn't finished. You want to talk about liability? Margaret's voice rose slightly, carrying the accumulated pain of decades. What about your liability to the patients who trusted this hospital to treat them with dignity? What about your liability to employees who dedicated their lives to keeping this place running? She pulled out a photograph from her briefcase, the picture of her and her grandchildren that had hung in her locker for years. My grandson Tyler spent 3 weeks fighting for his life in your NICU. I worked every shift during those 3 weeks because I couldn't afford to miss work, but I visited him during my breaks because he was my family. And you documented those visits as security violations. Dr. Steinberg leaned back in his chair, his expression shifting from patronizing concern to something approaching discomfort. Mrs. Sullivan, I think you're becoming a bit emotional. Emotional. Margaret laughed, but there was no humor in it. Dr. Steinberg, I've spent 37 years watching you and your colleagues treat me like I was invisible, like I was just a piece of equipment that cleaned up after you. And now that I'm finally speaking up, you're calling me emotional? She pulled out Marcus's security reports, spreading them across the polished table. These documents show that Dr. Harrison has been taking medical supplies home for personal use for over a year. That's actual theft, not giving discarded blankets to homeless people. But Dr. Harrison's violations aren't being prosecuted, are they? Ashley Morrison's face flushed red. Those allegations are unsubstantiated, unlike the allegations against me. Margaret's eyes flashed. You docked my final paycheck for magazines I saved from the recycling bin. Magazines I gave to lonely patients because no one else bothered to notice they needed something to read. Rebecca Chen placed a supportive hand on Margaret's shoulder, but Margaret wasn't ready to stop. 37 years of silence was ending right here, in this boardroom, in front of these people who had finally been forced to see her as more than a ghost moving through their periphery. I know what you think of people like me, Margaret continued, her voice now carrying the authority of someone who had finally found her truth. You think we should be grateful for whatever scraps of employment you throw our way. You think we should accept being treated as less than human because we don't have medical degrees or MBA diplomas. She looked around the table, making eye contact with each person present. But I know things about this hospital that you've forgotten or chosen to ignore. I know which doctors leave messes for others to clean up, and which ones show basic human decency. I know which administrators care about patients, and which ones only care about profit margins. I know because I was there every night, watching and cleaning and listening. Dr. Steinberg attempted to regain control of the meeting. Mrs. Sullivan, if you have concerns about other staff members' behavior, there are proper channels. Proper channels. Margaret's voice cracked with bitter laughter. Dr. Steinberg, the proper channels are designed to protect people like you from people like me. They're designed to keep the invisible people invisible. She gathered the documents spread across the table, her movements deliberate and dignified. But I'm not invisible anymore. And I'm not going to pretend that what you did to me was justified or legal or morally acceptable. Margaret stood up, smoothing down her dress with the same careful attention she had once given to her work uniform. 37 years ago, I started working here because I needed a job to feed my children. I stayed because I believed that honest work, performed with dignity, meant something. I gave you everything I had, my time, my energy, my compassion, my loyalty. She picked up her borrowed briefcase, feeling its weight as a symbol of the new person she was becoming. What you gave me in return was invisibility, condescension, and ultimately, betrayal. But you made one mistake. The room held its breath. You assumed that because I cleaned your floors, I didn't have the intelligence or the courage to fight back. You assumed that because I accepted your treatment for 37 years, I would continue accepting it forever. Margaret walked toward the door, then turned back one final time. I won't be accepting your settlement offer. I won't be signing any agreements that require my silence, and I won't be pretending that what happened here was anything other than discrimination against someone you considered beneath your notice. As Margaret left the boardroom, her footsteps echoing in the marble hallway, she felt something she hadn't experienced in decades, the profound relief of someone who had finally spoken her truth, regardless of the consequences. Behind her, the room erupted in urgent whispers and panicked phone calls, but Margaret kept walking, her head held high, no longer invisible, no longer silent, no longer willing to accept the unacceptable. For the first time in 37 years, Margaret Sullivan was exactly who she was meant to be. The news van parked outside Chicago General Hospital arrived at 6 a.m., its satellite dish piercing the grey October sky like a metallic flower reaching for light. Inside the hospital, Administrator Ashley Morrison watched from her office window as reporter Jennifer Walsh, no relation to the hospital's attorney, adjusted her microphone and prepared for the morning broadcast that would change everything. Margaret had kept her word. She wasn't going to remain silent. Rebecca Chen had connected Margaret with investigative journalist Sarah Martinez from Channel 7 News, a woman who specialized in exposing institutional corruption and worker exploitation. Sarah had taken one look at Margaret's story, Marcus's documentation, and the hospital's arrogant response, and recognized a story that would resonate far beyond Chicago's city limits. Good morning, I'm Jennifer Walsh reporting from Chicago General Hospital, where a shocking pattern of employee discrimination has been uncovered, the reporter announced to her television audience. Margaret Sullivan worked as a custodial engineer here for 37 years of perfect attendance, exemplary service, and what hospital administrators are now calling policy violations that include helping sick patients and visiting her own hospitalized grandson. Inside the hospital, televisions in waiting rooms and patient lounges displayed Margaret's employee photo, a professional headshot from the hospital's staff directory that showed her gentle smile and tired but kind eyes. Patients and visitors, who had never noticed her during her decades of service, were now learning her name and her story. The broadcast continued with an interview Margaret had given the previous day, sitting in her small kitchen, with her hands folded in her lap, speaking with the quiet dignity that had characterized her entire working life. "I never asked for special treatment," Margaret said on screen, her voice steady but heavy with emotion. "I just wanted to be treated like a human being. When someone is scared or in pain, you help them. That's not a policy violation, that's basic human decency." Dr. Harrison, watching from the doctor's lounge, felt his coffee growing cold in his hands. The woman he had dismissed as background noise for decades was now speaking to thousands of people about his behavior, his casual cruelty, his systematic dehumanization of hospital staff he considered beneath his notice. "She's making us all look bad," Dr. Pemberton muttered, but his complaint sounded hollow, even to himself. The evidence was overwhelming, and their own words and actions were being replayed for public judgment. The hospital's phone lines lit up immediately. Patients who remembered Margaret began calling to share their own stories of her kindness. Mrs. Chen, the elderly woman Margaret had quietly helped with magazines and gentle conversation, spoke tearfully to reporters about how Margaret's small acts of care had made her hospital stay bearable during the darkest period of her life. "She was angel," Mrs. Chen said in her accented English, tears streaming down her face. "Every night she makes sure I have something to read, make sure I'm not alone. Hospital people, they not see her, but she see everyone." Tommy Rodriguez, now 11 years old and in remission from his childhood leukemia, appeared on camera with his parents to talk about the woman who had checked on him during his darkest nights of fear and pain. "Ms. Margaret made sure my nightlight worked," Tommy said with the simple honesty of a child. "When I was scared, she would fix my blankets and tell me everything would be okay. She was right." The stories multiplied throughout the day. Maria Santos, the nursing assistant who had witnessed Margaret's kindness firsthand, was interviewed about the culture of fear that prevented staff from speaking up about injustice. Marcus Johnson, the security guard who had risked his job to provide evidence, became an unexpected hero for his willingness to document the truth. "Working people deserve respect," Marcus told the cameras. "Mrs. Sullivan gave 37 years of her life to that hospital, and they threw her away like she was nothing. But she's not nothing. She's someone's grandmother, someone's mother, someone who made that place better just by being there." By noon, the story had been picked up by national news outlets. Social media exploded with Gwanak's Justice for Margaret and Invisible No More hashtags. Working people across the country shared their own stories of being devalued, dismissed, and discarded by institutions that profited from their labor while denying their humanity. The hospital's board of directors convened an emergency meeting. Phone calls poured in from investors, donors, and community leaders, expressing outrage at the institution's treatment of a long-term employee. The hospital's reputation, carefully cultivated over decades, was crumbling in real time. Margaret sat in her living room, watching the news coverage with a mixture of amazement and terror. She had wanted justice, but she hadn't anticipated the overwhelming response from strangers who saw their own struggles reflected in her story. Her phone rang constantly. Reporters requesting interviews, lawyers offering services, advocacy groups inviting her to speak at events. But the call that mattered most came from her daughter Sarah, who drove over immediately after seeing the morning news. "Mom," Sarah said, tears in her eyes as she hugged Margaret tight, "I had no idea. I knew your job was hard, but I never understood. Why didn't you tell us how they were treating you?" Margaret looked at her daughter, a successful teacher with a master's degree, a comfortable middle-class life, and the kind of professional respect Margaret had never experienced. "Honey, you've worked so hard to build a better life than mine. I didn't want you to know that some people still see us as less than human because of where we came from." Sarah's tears came harder then. "Mom, you're the strongest person I know. You raised us by yourself, worked nights so you could be there during the day, never complained about anything. You deserve so much better than what they gave you." The conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Margaret opened it to find a woman in her 40s, wearing a professional suit and carrying flowers. "Mrs. Sullivan, my name is Dr. Patricia Gonzalez. I'm the new interim chief medical officer at Chicago General. Could I speak with you for a moment?" Margaret invited her in, confused and wary. Dr. Gonzalez sat on the edge of Margaret's worn sofa and looked directly into her eyes, the kind of direct eye contact that had been denied to Margaret for 37 years. "Mrs. Sullivan, I want to apologize on behalf of the hospital for the unconscionable way you were treated. What happened to you was wrong, morally, ethically, and legally wrong." Margaret studied this woman who was speaking to her with the respect typically reserved for people of higher social standing. "Are you here to offer me a settlement?" Dr. Gonzalez shook her head. "I'm here to offer you something much more important than money, though we'll certainly be discussing fair compensation. I'm here to offer you vindication." She pulled out a thick folder. "Effective immediately, Dr. Harrison has been suspended pending investigation. Ashley Morrison has been terminated for falsifying employment records. The entire HR department is being restructured with new leadership and new policies." Margaret felt her breath catch. "What does that mean for me?" "It means that your personnel file is being corrected to reflect your actual service record. 37 years of exemplary performance with no disciplinary actions. It means that you'll receive a formal letter of recommendation praising your dedication and character. And it means that if you choose to return to Chicago General in any capacity, you'll be welcomed with the respect and dignity you should have received from day one." Dr. Gonzalez leaned forward, her expression intense. "But Mrs. Sullivan, I also want to offer you something else. The hospital is creating a new position, patient advocate and staff liaison, someone who understands both the importance of medical protocol and the value of human compassion. Someone who can ensure that no employee is ever again treated as invisible or disposable." Margaret stared at her. "You're offering me a job. I'm offering you the chance to transform the culture that tried to destroy you, to make sure that what happened to you never happens to anyone else. The position comes with a substantial salary increase, full benefits, and the authority to implement changes that put human dignity at the center of everything we do." That evening, Margaret sat in her kitchen with the job offer in front of her, weighing a decision that would determine not just her future, but her legacy. She could take the settlement money and try to disappear back into invisibility, or she could return to the place that had broken her spirit and use her experience to build something better. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Tommy Rodriguez's mother. "Mrs. Sullivan, Tommy wanted me to tell you that you're his hero. He says you taught him that angels don't always have wings. Sometimes they just have kind hearts and mop buckets." Margaret smiled, and for the first time in decades, she knew exactly who she was and what she was meant to do. She picked up her pen and signed the contract. Margaret Sullivan was going back to Chicago General Hospital, not as invisible custodial staff, but as the voice of every worker who had ever been overlooked, undervalued, or discarded. She was going back to change everything. 6 months later, Margaret Sullivan walked through the revolving doors of Chicago General Hospital for the first time as patient advocate and staff liaison. But this time she carried herself differently. Her navy blue blazer was new, purchased with her first paycheck from a position that paid 3 times what she had earned as custodial staff. Her hair was styled professionally, and she wore a name badge that read, Margaret Sullivan, Patient Advocate, in bold letters that commanded respect rather than invisibility. The transformation wasn't just external. Margaret moved through the corridors with the quiet confidence of someone who had discovered her own worth and refused to accept anything less than dignity. She no longer averted her eyes when doctors passed, no longer stepped aside to make herself smaller in spaces where she belonged. Her office was on the 3rd floor, with windows overlooking the city and a mahogany desk that had once seemed impossibly grand to someone who had eaten lunch standing in utility closets. But Margaret had quickly learned that respect often began with the symbols of authority, and her office served as a visible reminder that the hospital's hierarchy was changing. The first major test of her new role came during morning rounds, when she accompanied Dr. Patricia Gonzalez to address complaints from the nursing staff about patient care protocols. Margaret listened, as nurses described feeling pressured to rush through patient interactions, to prioritize efficiency over compassion, to treat sick people as medical cases rather than frightened human beings. The problem, explained Nurse Linda Morrison, no relation to the terminated Ashley Morrison, is that administration measures everything except what actually matters. They count how many patients we see per hour, but not whether those patients felt heard and cared for. Margaret nodded, remembering her own years of being measured solely by how many floors she mopped rather than how many patients she comforted. What if we changed the metrics, she suggested. What if patient satisfaction and emotional care were weighted equally with medical efficiency? Dr. Gonzalez looked intrigued. What do you have in mind? Over the following weeks, Margaret worked with nursing staff to develop new evaluation criteria that rewarded compassionate care alongside clinical competence. She created protocols for acknowledging patients' emotional needs, for recognizing when someone needed extra time or attention, for treating family members with the same respect given to medical professionals. But her most important work happened in the quiet moments between official duties. Margaret made it her practice to visit every department during each shift, not as an inspector, but as someone who understood the challenges faced by workers at every level. She remembered what it felt like to be invisible, to have your contributions overlooked, to feel that your voice didn't matter in institutional decisions. In the cafeteria, she sat with food service workers who shared stories of being yelled at by stressed doctors, of being blamed for problems beyond their control, of feeling undervalued despite their essential role in patient care. Margaret listened with the deep attention of someone who had lived those experiences, and she acted on what she heard. When kitchen staff complained about being excluded from patient care discussions, Margaret created monthly meetings where dietary workers could share observations about patients' eating habits and nutritional needs. When custodial workers reported feeling unsafe cleaning certain areas late at night, Margaret advocated for improved lighting and security protocols. Her most meaningful intervention came when she encountered Rosa Martinez, a young woman working the night cleaning shift who reminded Margaret of her younger self, quiet, hard-working, and completely invisible to the medical staff. Margaret found Rosa crying in a supply closet after Dr. Peterson had publicly berated her for cleaning near the nurses' station during shift change. The scene was painfully familiar, a dedicated worker being humiliated for doing her job in the presence of people who considered her presence an inconvenience. "Rosa," Margaret said gently, sitting beside her on an overturned bucket, "tell me what happened." Through tears, Rosa explained that she was a pre-med student working nights to pay for college, that she dreamed of becoming a doctor, but felt crushed by the daily reminder that people like her weren't welcome in professional medical settings. Margaret's heart ached with recognition. Here was a brilliant young woman whose aspirations were being systematically crushed by the same culture of dismissal and dehumanization that had nearly destroyed Margaret's own spirit. "Rosa, do you know what I used to do in this hospital?" Margaret asked. The young woman shook her head. "I mopped these floors for 37 years. I was invisible to people like Dr. Peterson for most of my adult life, They fired me for being too compassionate, for caring too much about patients and not enough about their arbitrary rules. Rosa looked confused. But you're the patient advocate now. You have an office and everything. Margaret smiled. I have those things because I finally learned that my worth isn't determined by other people's ability to see it. You're studying to be a doctor, Rosa. That means you understand science, critical thinking, human anatomy, skills that Dr. Peterson respects when they belong to people he considers his equals. Over the following months, Margaret became Rosa's mentor and advocate. She helped her apply for medical school scholarships, connected her with physicians who believed in nurturing talent regardless of background, and created a hospital program that provided educational support for employees pursuing advanced degrees. But Margaret's most significant achievement was changing the culture that had nearly destroyed both of them. She instituted weekly dignity rounds, where she personally ensured that every employee, from brain surgeons to maintenance workers, was treated with basic respect. She created an anonymous reporting system for workplace harassment and discrimination, with real consequences for violations, regardless of the perpetrator's position in the hospital hierarchy. When Dr. Peterson was caught on security cameras berating a housekeeping worker, Margaret didn't just file a report, she sat him down for a conversation that changed his perspective forever. Dr. Peterson, she said, her voice calm but firm, that woman you humiliated yesterday has a bachelor's degree in chemistry and speaks 4 languages. She's working here to support her family while studying for her nursing certification. What exactly makes you think your medical degree gives you the right to treat her as less than human? The confrontation was different from her explosive boardroom speech months earlier. This was Margaret at her most powerful, not angry or defensive, but absolutely certain of her own authority and completely unwilling to tolerate disrespect toward any hospital employee. Dr. Peterson, faced with someone who refused to be intimidated by his status, was forced to confront his own behavior. Within weeks, his interactions with staff became noticeably more courteous, and he began acknowledging the contributions of non-medical workers in ways that surprised everyone who knew him. Margaret's influence spread throughout the hospital, like ripples in a pond. Nurses began advocating for better treatment of support staff. Administrators started including maintenance workers and food service employees in policy discussions. The culture of invisible labor and casual dehumanization was slowly being replaced by something unprecedented: actual respect for every person who contributed to patient care. The most powerful moment came during the hospital's annual Employee Appreciation Dinner, an event Margaret had attended once as an outsider, but now helped organize as an advocate for inclusive recognition. This year, the dinner honored employees from every department. Rosa Martinez received an award for academic achievement and community service. Marcus Johnson was recognized for his integrity and courage in speaking truth to power. Even the night custodial staff, people who had been invisible for decades, were acknowledged for their essential contributions to patient safety and hospital operations. Margaret stood at the podium, looking out at an audience that included everyone from brain surgeons to parking lot attendants, all sitting together as equals for perhaps the first time in the hospital's history. "A year ago," she began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had earned her platform through suffering and transformation, "I was fired from this hospital for caring too much about the people we serve. I was told that my compassion was a liability, that my dedication was inappropriate, that my humanity had no place in professional medical care." The room was completely silent, every person present understanding that they were witnessing something historic. "Tonight I want to tell you something I wish someone had told me during those 37 years when I felt invisible. Your work matters. Your dignity matters. Your voice matters. And no one, no matter how many degrees they have or how much power they wield, has the right to make you feel otherwise." Margaret paused, looking directly at Rosa, at Marcus, at the custodial workers and food service staff and security guards who kept the hospital running while remaining unnoticed. This hospital saves lives not because of any single person, but because of all of us working together with respect, compassion, and recognition of our shared humanity. We are not invisible. We are not disposable. We are the heart of everything good that happens within these walls. The standing ovation lasted 5 minutes, with doctors and administrators applauding alongside the very workers they had previously ignored. But for Margaret, the real victory was seeing Rosa Martinez smile with the confidence of someone who finally understood her own worth. Margaret Sullivan had returned to Chicago General Hospital not for revenge, but for transformation. She had turned her pain into purpose, her suffering into strength, and her invisibility into a platform for ensuring that no one would ever again be treated as less than human within those walls. She had become exactly who she was always meant to be, a force for dignity, justice, and the radical idea that every person deserves to be seen. 2 years later, Margaret Sullivan stood in the auditorium of Northwestern University's medical school, adjusting the microphone as 200 future doctors looked up at her with the respectful attention once reserved for distinguished professors and renowned surgeons. She wore a charcoal grey suit that spoke of success earned through struggle, and her name badge read, "Guest Speaker, Margaret Sullivan, National Advocate for Healthcare Worker Dignity." The invitation to speak had come from Dr. Rosa Martinez, the same young woman Margaret had found crying in a supply closet, who was now in her second year of medical school with a full scholarship funded by the Margaret Sullivan Foundation for Healthcare Worker Education. "Students," Margaret began, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had transformed pain into purpose. "Today I want to talk to you about something they don't teach in medical textbooks, the invisible people who will make your careers possible." She clicked to her first slide, a photograph of herself from 37 years ago, young and hopeful in her crisp new custodial uniform, standing proudly in front of Chicago General Hospital on her first day of work. "This is me at 26, a widow with 2 small children, grateful for a job that would let me provide for my family while working nights so I could be present during my children's daylight hours. I thought I was just taking a cleaning job. I didn't realize I was beginning a lifetime education in how healthcare really works." The students leaned forward, sensing this wouldn't be a typical medical school lecture about procedures and protocols. Margaret advanced to the next slide, the hospital's organizational chart, with doctors at the top and a long list of support staff at the bottom. "For most of my career, I existed down here," she said, pointing to the smallest text at the bottom of the chart. "Environmental services, food service, security, transportation, the people who keep hospitals running but remain invisible to most medical professionals." She told them about Mrs. Chen, about Tommy Rodriguez, about the countless patients whose healing had been aided not just by medical intervention, but by simple human kindness from people whose job descriptions didn't include compassion, but who provided it anyway. "I want you to understand something crucial," Margaret continued, her voice growing stronger. "The janitor who mops your floors has often been in that hospital longer than you'll be there for residency. The food service worker who brings patient meals might speak 3 languages and hold a college degree. The security guard who checks your ID every morning might be studying for his EMT certification at night." A young student raised her hand. "Mrs. Sullivan, how did the medical staff treat you during your years as custodial worker?" Margaret paused, remembering the careful balance she had to maintain between honesty and hope. These students would soon enter a system that needed their compassion, not their cynicism. "Some treated me with respect and kindness," she said truthfully. "They learned my name, asked about my family, recognized that my work mattered. But others," she let the silence speak for itself, "others treated me as if I was invisible, as if my humanity was less important than my function." She clicked to the next slide, a photo from the transformed Chicago General Hospital, showing doctors, nurses, and support staff working together as equals during a patient care planning meeting. "But here's what I learned. Respect isn't something you can demand from others. It's something you must first claim for yourself. For 37 years, I accepted treatment that no human being should accept because I believed that my background, my education level, my job title made me less deserving of dignity." Margaret's voice carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom. "When I finally spoke up, when I finally refused to remain invisible, everything changed. Not just for me, but for everyone who came after me." She told them about the Margaret Sullivan protocols, now implemented in over 200 hospitals nationwide, policies ensuring that all healthcare workers are treated with dignity, regardless of their role in the institutional hierarchy. She described the mentorship programs connecting medical professionals with support staff, pursuing education, the anonymous reporting systems for workplace harassment, the cultural training that helped everyone understand their interdependence. "Today, Rosa Martinez is in her second year of medical school," Margaret said, gesturing to the young woman sitting in the front row, tears of pride streaming down her face. But she'll never forget what it felt like to be invisible, and that memory will make her a better doctor than any textbook ever could. Margaret clicked to her final slide, a simple text that read, "Every person in your hospital has a story. Every person deserves dignity. Every person matters. When you begin your medical careers," she concluded, "you'll be tempted to focus solely on the patients in your care. That focus is essential, but I want you to remember that healing happens in communities, not isolation. The person who cleans your workspace, who delivers your meals, who secures your building, they're part of the healing process too." A student in the back row stood up. "Mrs. Sullivan, what would you say to healthcare workers who feel invisible or undervalued right now?" Margaret's eyes sparkled with the fierce, protective love she'd developed for every worker struggling to maintain dignity in systems designed to ignore them. "I would tell them what I wish someone had told me 37 years ago. You are not invisible. You are not disposable. Your work matters. Your voice matters. And your dignity is not negotiable." She paused, letting the words settle. "And I would tell them that change is possible, but it starts with refusing to accept the unacceptable, even when, especially when, that refusal feels impossible." After her speech, Margaret was surrounded by students asking questions, sharing their own stories of family members in service jobs, pledging to remember her message when they began treating patients. But the moment that moved her most came when a young man approached with tears in his eyes. "Mrs. Sullivan, my mother has been a hospital cleaner for 20 years. She's never been to one of my school events because she's always working nights, and I was embarrassed by her job. After hearing you speak, I realized she's been a healthcare hero this whole time, and I never even recognized it." Margaret hugged him tightly. "Call her tonight," she whispered. "Tell her you're proud of her. Tell her she matters. Trust me, she needs to hear it." That evening, Margaret sat in her comfortable living room. The apartment she'd nearly lost had been replaced by a small house with a garden where she grew vegetables for the community food bank. The walls were decorated with awards from labor organizations, thank you letters from workers whose lives had been changed by her advocacy, and photos from her grandchildren's graduations, events she could now attend because she no longer worked nights. Her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus Johnson, who had leveraged his newfound respect into a position as Director of Hospital Security. "Saw the video of your Northwestern speech. Rosa's going to be an amazing doctor. You're changing the world, Mrs. Sullivan." Another message came from Tommy Rodriguez, now 14 and volunteering at the Children's Hospital, where Margaret served on the board of directors. "Ms. Margaret, I told my friends about you today. They think you're awesome. I always knew you were a superhero." But the message that meant the most came from a woman named Elena Rodriguez, no relation to Tommy, who worked the night shift at a hospital in Detroit. "Mrs. Sullivan, I heard about your story on the radio. Yesterday, my supervisor actually said thank you for the first time in 3 years. I know that's because of the work you're doing. Thank you for giving people like us a voice." Margaret closed her eyes and thought about the journey that had brought her here, from the devastating text message that ended her career to the standing ovation she'd received from future doctors who would carry her message into their own practice of medicine. The pain hadn't disappeared entirely. Some nights she still woke up remembering the humiliation, the sense of worthlessness, the crushing weight of being invisible in her own workplace. But that pain had been transformed into something powerful, a determination that no one else would suffer the same indignities she had endured. Margaret walked to her kitchen and made herself a cup of tea, a simple pleasure she'd learned to enjoy in the evenings, now that she no longer worked nights. As she sat at her table, she opened her laptop to respond to emails from workers across the country who reached out for advice, support, and encouragement. Each message reminded her that her story had become larger than her personal experience. She had become a symbol of the possibility that invisible people could become visible, that discarded workers could reclaim their dignity, that systems designed to dehumanize could be transformed by individuals brave enough to demand better. Margaret's reflection was interrupted by her doorbell. She opened it to find Dr. Patricia Gonzalez holding a bottle of champagne and a huge smile. "Margaret," Dr. Gonzalez announced, "the AMA just approved the Margaret Sullivan Standards for Healthcare Worker Dignity as recommended practices for all accredited hospitals. Your protocols are going national." As they celebrated this milestone, Margaret thought about all the workers who would benefit from policies ensuring respectful treatment, fair evaluation processes, and protection from harassment. She thought about future Rosa Martinez's, who wouldn't have to cry in supply closets, future Marcus Johnsons, who wouldn't have to risk their jobs to document injustice. Later that night, as Margaret prepared for bed, she looked at herself in the mirror, the same mirror where she'd once seen only a tired woman in a faded uniform, invisible and forgotten. Now she saw someone who had learned that dignity couldn't be taken away by others, it could only be surrendered by yourself. Margaret Sullivan had spent 37 years learning to be invisible. She had spent the last 2 years teaching the world that no one needed to disappear. And tomorrow, she would continue that work. One conversation, one policy change, one transformed life at a time. Have you ever experienced being invisible in your workplace, or do you know someone who has faced similar challenges? If this story touched your heart, please leave a like and subscribe. It helps spread this important message about dignity and respect for all workers. The legacy of Margaret Sullivan wasn't just about one woman's transformation. It was about proving that every person, regardless of their job title, education level, or position in society's hierarchy, deserves to be seen, valued, and treated with the fundamental respect that makes us human. Congratulations. Type 9 in the comments so that I know you stayed until the end with me. Thank you for watching.